In this video, I'll demonstrate and explain the use of simple types and facets within the XML Designer of Visual Studio.net. Now, as we noted from the last video, that a schema is basically used to define how an XML document should look like. And XML documents are typically made up of elements and attributes. So as we set out to define a schema, we'll set out to define what are the correct formation of elements and attributes that should be contained within an XML document. Now, elements and attributes all have an associated data type, which constricts the type of data that can be contained within that given element or given attribute. Now, in some cases, you'll be able to use what are known as the built-in data types. These are defined in an XSD specification by the World Wide Web Consortium, the W3C. And they include data types such as strings and longs and integers and floats and booleans and so forth. However, there might be situations where you want to create your own data type to further restrict the type of information that can be contained within an element or attribute. And so what we'll do is create these simple types by dragging a simple type and dropping it into our designer surface. And what we'll do is, to illustrate this point, is we'll create a simple type called state. And state will be based on a data type called string. Now, we can select other approved data types from the specification, but for our purposes, string will work just fine. But if we stopped here, there would be nothing special about this simple type. Just to state that it was a string. What we need to do is further restrict the type of data that can be contained within a data type of state. And to do that, we'll add facets. You can add a facet by merely going into the little data grid and selecting facet from the drop-down list box. And in the middle column, you get to select the type of facet that's available to you for the given data type that you're basing your simple type on. So, for example, we see the following facets available since we selected this to be a string. However, if I were to select, let's say an integer or a long, notice that the types of facets change to include more numerical type of information. Now, all of these the facets, we're not going to look into them each individually. Some of them are fairly obvious in what they do and by restricting the type of information. However, I've provided a link on the data page for this video that allows you to look at the help for an explanation of each and every one of these settings if you're so inclined to look there. But just knowing that they exist is really half the battle. So we're going to go back to string, and so the first facet that we're going to select is a length, and we're going to set the length at 2. That means a state must be a string, but it can only be 2 characters long. The next thing that we're going to do is add another facet. This time, instead of dropping our facet box down, what I'm going to do instead is go to our toolbox and drag facet and drop it into our simple type. And we'll leave it at the enumeration. Now, enumeration means that it can only the state can only be one of the values that are within the enumeration. So, for example, I'm going to add TX for Texas. I'll add another enumeration, NY for New York. We'll add another facet, IL for Illinois, and another enumeration. We'll pick CA for California. Okay, so what this means is that the state can only be 2 characters wide, and it has to be one of these 4 values in order for it to be a valid state data type. So now that we've created this simple type, what can we do with it? Well, in and of itself, it doesn't really do anything. Let's take a look at the XML behind the scenes. All that's defined is a simple type with the name of state, and then we have a restriction element, and these are the following restrictions. The length must be 2, and it must be either California, Illinois, New York, or Texas, because those are defined as enumerations for our simple type, named state. What we'll do, briefly, is go ahead and add an element to our XFD, and we'll call this element address. And so we'll put like street, and we'll leave that as string, city, and zip code. And then we get down to what we want to use, which is the state that we've created here as a simple type. And so what we can do is drag and drop. I'm sorry, we can't drag and drop. I apologize. What we have to do, we'll call it state, and then we'll drop down our list box of data types, and you'll notice that one of the values is now state. And so now our state will use the simple type called state. And we probably should have changed this name to something that wouldn't conflict with the actual element name, but I think you get the idea that this state element is now constrained since it is a type of data type of state which has these restriction values in it. So let's take a look at the XML quickly before we conclude this video. You'll notice that we've created, or I'm sorry, that we've generated an element called address, and that element had a street, a city, a zip, and it had a state of type state. That type of state is defined in this simple type of state. And so what simple types allow you to do are to abstract away information that might be global to other elements that we have within our schema. For example, if I create like an element called shipping, I can still use the state that I defined here and all the restrictions, and now I have to do that again for this second element. So it allows us to kind of abstract and make global all the different data types that we're going to need that are custom to our particular application or our particular company. So that is the end of our discussion about simple types and facets. We hope you enjoyed this and learned a lot about the XML Designer in relationship to simple types.